Hello everyone, welcome to the Adkup Show. Today we will try to understand African continent, what will be its future and what role it will play in the multipolar world, which we will be having very soon. So without wasting time, let's get started. So let's first start with my favorite topic of bread and butter, that is economics. So when we talk about Africa as a whole continent, then the majority of all the economic parameters fails because the disparity and inequality among the different regions in African continent is just too big. So the economic parameters like income and GDP per capita isn't really useful. However, it can be used when we are discussing any particular country in the African continent. But still, the GDP growth rate of the African continent is projected to be around 3.8% in 2024 and 4.2% in 2025. These figures don't really matter in Africa. The industry which matters the most in Africa is agriculture. Now, agriculture matters the most because that's what Africa needs to sustain itself. It means Africa needs food, and guess what? African continent is heavily dependent on food imports. They import more than 90% of their food grains. That's an insane amount. Their food import bill is more than $100 billion. And according to some estimates, it's actually even more higher. The amount can be as high as $150 billion. Now, this situation is not good at all in a multipolar world. It's not good because there will be multiple powers who will be competing with each other. And in this scenario, there's a high probability of Africa becoming a battleground. To be honest, Africa is actually still a battleground. This is because Africa has resources. The countries which supply Africa with food will influence the continent the most. Further moving on with economics, the top 5 major economies in Africa are South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, Nigeria, and Ethiopia, with GDPs ranging from $205 billion to $373 billion. These 5 countries represent 38% of Africa's population and close to 40% of the GDP. You might think that's pretty much equal distribution, but in reality, that's not true. Take Nigeria, for example. In 2014, their GDP was around $570 billion, making them the biggest economy of Africa. But now it has reduced to around $370 billion. By the way, this is the religious distribution in Nigeria. It's 50-50. North follows Islam and South follows Christianity. This kind of demographics is leading to socio-political unrest. The country is currently witnessing violence, armed conflicts, and massive unequal growth. 90% of Nigeria's revenue comes from oil sector, and the majority of that revenue goes to southern part of the country. This has made people in north very much dissatisfied. The entire country is heavily dependent on imports for almost everything, and there's not enough job opportunities. Now bring in multipolarity where major powers will be aggressively defending their interests. This situation will make Nigeria more vulnerable. North African country Egypt is also in the same boat with slight difference. The country is always vulnerable to socio-political destabilization and is heavily dependent on food imports as only 4% of Egypt's land is arable. What makes the situation bad is that the country is under heavy debt from IMF. Tourism plays a significant role in their economy, but as Europe's purchasing power erodes, Egypt will probably have to look for another alternative. Now, this is because the majority of the tourists are actually from Europe. Now, even South Africa, Algeria, and Ethiopia aren't really doing well. But the reality is that the future of African continent will depend on these countries. These countries are not just top 5 biggest economies, but they're also top 5 most powerful militaries in the African continent. So cutting short, these countries will have to play their cards very well if African continent wants to achieve stability. Now, in order to achieve this, these 5 countries will have to look inwards rather than outwards. it means they will have to play a role of a leader. For example, trade deals like African Continental Free Trade Area AFCFTA is something which is extremely good and is required. This is where a real magic happens. It means Africa needs to build more internal supply chains and increase the trade within the continent, which currently sits at just 20% of the total trade. And that 20% is also not much of a high quality. Now, Africa's got goods. Africa has 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including cobalt, lithium, and rare earth, which are vital for tech and green energy. But here's the real deal in multipolar world. Africa's economic growth will directly influence Africa's future. Alright, let's shift gears to something a bit more challenging, that is conflict. Africa's dealing with at least 35 non-international armed conflicts, from Sudan's civil war to insurgencies in Mozambique. These aren't just local issues, they are regional and global headaches. Africa don't have much time. It needs to figure out the solution to all these problems before multipolar world comes into play, because in that scenario, major powers will utilize these cracks and faults for their own benefits. Now, take Sudan, for example. The conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and rapid support forces has led to massive displacement and humanitarian crisis, affecting stability across the region. In Ethiopia, internal conflicts in Tigray, Amhara, and Oromia are testing the country's unity and growth. Mozambique, with its Cabo Delgado insurgency, has drawn in regional military efforts, showing how conflicts can spill over borders. Somalia's ongoing fight with Al-Shabaab, South Sudan's persistent violence despite peace agreements, and DRC's merits of armed groups. These are all pieces of a complex puzzle which Africa has to solve by its own. By the way, in order to solve these problems, Africa has probably only maximum 10 years. But here's a twist. Conflicts can be catalyst for change. It's pushing for stronger regional corporations like African unions, peacekeeping missions, and efforts of regional economic communities like ECOWAS. However, ECOWAS has been used as a tool by French to punish countries like Burkina Faso and Niger. They did this because these two countries kindly drifted away from French influence. This has turned African countries against each other. In a multipolar world where every nation is looking for allies, Africa's approach to conflict resolution could define its international standing and influence. Now, if the country is divided or if there is too much of strife in society, well, in such societies and countries, you don't get any investment, and probably nobody takes those countries seriously because those countries at their core are extremely weak. Addressing these conflicts involve tackling root causes like poverty, corruption, and even climate change to some extent, especially in areas like Sahel where environmental issues fuel instability. The challenge is huge, but so is the opportunity to lead by example in peace building and conflict resolution. Now let's zoom out and talk about Africa's geopolitical cloud. To be honest, it's not much. The major countries are probably the top 5 economies, which I discussed earlier in this video. However, even those countries are having a decline and have a different positions on different matters. China's Belt and Road Initiative, the US push for strategic partnerships, and the EU's interest in sustainable development, well, Africa is vulnerable to becoming a battleground for these powers. China has become Africa's largest trading partner, but it's not just about trade, it's about influence. China has invested $50 billion in recent years. So how can Africa benefit from these competitions of big powers? Well, Africa can actually leverage these competition for better deals, technology transfers, and infrastructure development, which we are seeing done by Chinese. However, it needs to be intensified. Africa needs to sign deals even with Americans and Europeans for better infrastructure projects. Africa's strategic location, controlling access to key trade routes, like Suez Canal, where 12% of the world's trade passes through, gives it immense leverage. However, Africa might not be able to exercise that leverage as major powers will be directly involved in the future. Well, we are actually seeing them getting involved. We can pretty much see what's happening in the Red Sea. So what's next for Africa in this multipolar world? Well, the challenges are clear. It's governance and probably debt, corruption, etc., etc. Africa demographic advantage, however, with low quality human capital, resource wealth, and strategic position are assets to the world needs, and Africa knows it very well. The path forward is about balancing growth with sustainability, leveraging partnership without losing independence, and harnessing innovation for good of its own people. If Africa plays its cards right, it won't be just a big player in multipolar world, shaping not just its own future, but also the future of industrialization with its resources. And that's our wrap up on Africa and multipolar world. By the way, we haven't discussed even 1%, so I'll be making more such videos. So thanks for sticking with us. If you enjoyed this deep dive, give us a like, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in comments. Keep this conversation going in comments. Peace out.